Hey, welcome to this video. I am going to be showing you progress that I've made about learning how to author VS Code extensions. And this is part of an onboarding series of 2 videos to help you understand how we're going to build a VS Code extension that acts as a graphical user interface over the ClearML Sessions CLI tool to help data scientists make remote workstations on whatever compute that they have. I've created a GitHub repo for this project, and I'll tell you about how I arrived at this GitHub repo after I give you a demo of what I've made so far. Okay, I have a VS Code window here, and I'm opened up in a Python file, and because I'm opened up in a Python file, you can see I have the Python extension installed, and that Python extension reacts to me being in a Python file, therefore showing me that I have this Python virtual environment selector down here. If I weren't in a Python file, then I would not see this selector menu here. Okay, so I actually have a boilerplate VS Code extension going, and that VS Code extension is active in this environment. And I called the VS Code extension ClearML Session Manager, and I wrote a command to install ClearML Python dependencies. So watch this. I'm going to choose a different virtual environment. Actually, I'll start by choosing no virtual environment at all. So this is an invalid virtual environment. Let's see. Okay, cool. So I now have an invalid virtual environment. And so now I'm going to try to run this command that's exposed to me through the extension that I've started writing, and it's called install Python dependencies. So if I click this, we get an error from ClearML Session Manager saying that we have to select a Python interpreter. Okay, I will select an interpreter, and now this is pointing at a virtual environment, and I will try to run that again. And if I click install Python dependencies, I get a modal that pops up, and this modal says the ClearML Session Manager extension requires that these Python libraries be installed, and those libraries are ClearML and ClearML Session. And it asks if I want to install them in this current Python virtual environment. So awesome, I will click install, and they'll install. And if they didn't install successfully, I made it so that it would automatically take you to the VS Code extension log. So I learned that every VS Code extension has its own log stream that you can log to. You can actually have a VS Code extension log to multiple log streams, but basically you come into the output tab in VS Code, and this output tab has a drop-down menu, and in the drop-down menu, you can see the various log streams from different extensions. So here's my ClearML Session Manager extension, and check it out. These are the output logs from the pip install command that was run behind the scenes to install ClearML and ClearML Session into the virtual environment. So that's cool. Also interspersed with these logs are different debug log statements that tell us what's happening under the hood when we run this extension. All right, so basically where I've arrived is I've learned the anatomy of a VS Code extension to an extent. I still don't know how to create a sidebar menu or add buttons to that and wire it up, but I have learned how to interface with the Python extension by Microsoft and use this virtual environment selector. And I also learned a little bit about user experience with VS Code too. Like you may not have noticed, but when we were installing the Python libraries just now, there was a pop-up with a message saying installing, and it had like a loading bar by it, which is kind of a nice user feedback thing. So there's a good bit of, so in summary, I figured out how to interface with the Python extension. I figured out how to log with best practices from extension using something called output channels, which are basically log streams. So those are the list items that I showed you in that drop-down menu in the output tab. I also learned how to pop basic pop-up messages to the user and to put a button on that message, learning how to showing you which in one click allows you to link directly to error logs. And so there's an error handling component to that as well. Okay, I want to walk you through how I set this up because I think there's a lot you can learn about how a VS Code extension works. How I started was I followed a Hello World tutorial in VS Code. Here's the VS Code window where my project is. I followed this Hello World tutorial, and the tutorial had me use a CLI tool that generated all these boilerplate files here. So it generated me this Webpack config.js and a source folder and a README as well that I haven't bothered to change quite yet. So in the source folder in the boilerplate project, the only thing that it comes with is a test directory and then a file called extension.ts. This extension.ts file is the entry point to the whole extension. So this is a very important file. VS Code extensions have different connection points, different ways that your extension can extend VS Code. The extensions can actually extend VS Code in a lot of different ways. Like you could have an extension that adds more commands to the command palette up here. And that's what I did. I added the ClearML install dependencies command, but you could also have an extension add things to the sidebar. And you could have extensions add syntax highlighting, and you could have it add little UI elements down here, and you can have it add icons, and there's just a lot of things that you can add to an extension. So an extension doesn't have to just be a command in the command palette. You tell VS Code what parts of VS Code your extension extends by coming into this package.json file, and this was generated for me. So ordinarily package.json is just a file. It's kind of like pyproject.toml or requirements.txt. Like the main use case of package.json is to list what JavaScript libraries your project depends on. I'll just point out that I am not using, well, there are a lot of libraries listed here. I only manually installed 2 of them, and I'll show you how I need to install those in a second. But you can see there's this section of the package.json file called contributes, and here in this object, you define what connection points you're contributing to in VS Code. So there's an attribute of this called commands, and I added an element to this array here with my single command, and look, here's the title that we saw in the command palette. So this is where that like clearml, oh, I have to be inside of a Python file for this to register, I think. Oh no, I have to be in the activated, I have a special VS Code window where the extension is active. So yeah, in this that's where this title came from. Okay, and then with the title, I registered a JavaScript function, or TypeScript function, I should say, that gets triggered when you click the command with this title in the command palette. So basically this list item here is how you wire up a command with a function that it calls. So now we can go look at the function, and I can start to show you like how it all works. So I have a lot of code here. You would think that you would think this is a really unfair start to a hackathon because, oh my gosh, we have all these code files that we use. But actually what I did is I looked up the black formatter extension because it's publicly available on GitHub, and I actually copied most of this file from that extension. So for example, it had some really good utilities for working with the Python extension and finding information about the Python interpreter with VS Code. So a lot of work, you can see in this file, was thoughtfully done by the good people at Microsoft, and so I took some of those utilities for this. And by the way, they're licensed under the MIT license, so that's totally fine. We just have to give attribution back that we're using them for our derivative works. Okay, so let's look at the extension.ts file, because this is the entry point of the project, like I said. So this extension.ts file is almost exactly the boilerplate code that was generated from the Hello World project. I've added some imports, but that's just because they were necessary as I started writing some code down here. But the way an extension.ts file works is there are 2 functions that need to go inside of here. There should be a function called activate, and there should be a function called deactivate. And whenever you open up a VS Code window, VS Code loops over all the different extensions and calls their activate functions. Well, that's not quite true. The package.json can specify conditions of when your activate function gets activated. So for example, we could say that this function only ever gets activated when you open up a Python file. So you can specify like events of when this activate function actually gets called. So there are also events that can cause your extension to deactivate, like maybe when you close out of the window, although that's pretty fast. So I'm sure there are other events that cause deactivate to get triggered. I haven't filled this out at all, but let's look at the activate function here. So this is the first thing that's of note here is this function, register command. In the register command, look at this. I give it an identifier, and this is the identifier that we had in the package.json that we associate our command with. So basically, whatever happens here, we're defining a function in line. Whenever we call that command, the command with this identifier, by selecting the nicer aliased one in the command palette, this function here gets executed. So this is how my command works. We execute a function called ensure clearml session CLI is available, and that has this workflow where it prompts it checks to see if the Python extension is installed, and then it sees if a virtual environment has been selected, and if it hasn't been selected, it throws an error, and if it has, it checks to see if the clearml libraries are installed, and if they're not installed, it will pop a modal and invite you to install them, and if it fails to install, it links to error logs in the output channels. So that's what this one function does. And when the function finishes, this method right here, show information message, shows the success pop-up message that we saw. So pretty much this vscode.window global object that we can just import from this VS Code library has a bunch of functions that allow you to pop messages and stuff to the user. And I imagine that when we go to add our own menu on the sidebar, that will be done by accessing things on vscode.window. Let's talk about settings. VS Code has a settings system, which is awesome. Like I have a .vscode folder right here, and in there's a settings.json, and we could set things like linting settings and auto formatting settings here, but we can also set extension specific settings for our app. And so one of the nice things that came with the Black extension was this settings.typescript file. And I haven't changed this at all, but there's an interface here, which is kind of like a data class in Python. And we can say what custom settings we want our app to be able to have. So this is like this global settings object and there's a lot of utilities in this file that take care of reading the settings.json settings for our extension. And they don't just read them from settings.json. VS Code has this like very complex, rich settings mechanism where you can have like user settings and workspace settings and settings in this file. And this file here does the work of resolving all VS Code settings and has some really nice utility functions for accessing those. So that's great. That's a lot of work done for us. Okay, so that's the settings object, and it's grayed out because you see I'm not using it at all, so we don't have any custom settings yet. But this get extension settings function does all that work of providing this settings object for us, which is so cool. Okay, and then here's how we set up logging. There was a logging.typescript file, which had a lot of boilerplate code in it, which is great. And this basically, the short of this is it sets up the output channel, which is that drop-down item. And it makes it so that whenever we call any of these functions, trace log, trace error, trace warn, our logs will go to the output channel, which is awesome. So just whenever we want to do a print statement, we just use one of these functions here, and that becomes our logs, which is awesome. Okay, so the next thing, here's a console.log. It turns out, so like here I'm not using like a trace log statement, so this log would not go to the drop-down menu. If you go to the command palette and toggle developer tools, you can see that VS Code is actually a browser app. So this is like the same developer tools you'd see if you opened this up in Google Chrome. And any console log statements actually show up right here, just like it would in a browser. You can console log JSON objects and explore them. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so there's that line. Then we do the line where we register a command, and the command has a function that gets called every time we like this event gets triggered. It turns whenever you register a command, you get this thing called the disposable object. A disposable, I guess it's a design pattern. So the definition of a disposable is it's an object that has one method on it called dispose. And if you call dispose, it like deletes something. So like I guess we've registered this command. So disposable.dispose I think would unregister the command. So there's lots of different disposable objects that pop up in their abstraction, and I haven't really needed to mess with any of them. But check this out. This object is called context. Context is the only argument that gets passed into the VS Code function. I assume that it has information about like the window that's currently open and maybe some VS Code settings and stuff about the user workspace. But I haven't needed to touch it except for this one instance here, where we take our disposable, which represents our subscription to like this command event, and we pass that to the context. So I think this finishes registering our command with VS Code. So hopefully that's how that works. I have another thing here called load Python extension. This takes the context, and what's interesting is you can use this context object actually to grab information about other VS Code extensions. So check this out. There's a thing called extension, and there's the activate function. So this context object, I'm not sure exactly where, but it has a map, a hash map or like a dictionary of extension IDs to the extension. So like I have a bunch of extensions installed, and one of them is the remote SSH extension, and one of them is the Python extension. We can grab VS Code's object representation of those using this context object, and then like use that to invoke the commands of the other extensions. So like, for example, I want to make sure that if people are using this extension, having the Python extension installed is obviously a prerequisite, because we need that to be able to have the interpreter selector thing. And so that feature comes from the Python extension. So check this out. This load Python extension accepts the context, and then that context gets passed into a function here called initialize Python. And if you dig into that, it basically grabs a reference to this extension and like uses some of the attributes and functions on it to make sure that it's been loaded. So cool. So that is the extension at a high level. I will show you in closing some of the things that I've done here. So all of these files, logging, Python, constants, settings, status, utilities, and VS Code API, not shell.ts. I did write that one. All of these came from the Microsoft VS Code Black formatter extension, and they've had some really great utilities, and I've been able to just piggyback off of how Microsoft formatted their extension, which is fantastic. And I have added a couple lines to like constants.ts and python.ts, and then like one small change to logging. So let's look at python.ts. One of the things I did was actually a good way to do this is let's trace extension.ts. So check this out. Whenever you invoke this command, here's how our ensure clear mail session CLI is available works. So let's drill into that. Okay, the first thing it does is it looks for the Python interpreter. So it wants the Python interpreter to be configured. If it's not, then this function will prompt the user and tell them to configure it. Let's look at how prompting the user works. So I have a function that gets the path to the active Python interpreter. And if we drill into this, you'll see that we're actually using we're using a reference to if we go deep enough down the stack trace, you'll see that we're referencing the Python extension to get that information. So that's good. So that will prompt if the interpreter is not configured. So yes, the first thing that we did there is we got a path to the active Python interpreter. That's undefined if they haven't specified an interpreter yet. So if the interpreter is not set, this update status here is basically a log statement, trace, and it says please select a Python interpreter. So this ends up in the output channel, which is that special log stream just for our extension. And then this trace error does the same thing. It says you could select a Python interpreter or you could do this other thing. Because this is an error case, this show error message to the user, this is the line of code that pops a message saying please select your Python interpreter. Okay, awesome. That's how that works. Once we know that the interpreter is configured, we can grab the value of the interpreter path. And that's what this function does. So the end result of this function here is we grab the Python path that is associated with the virtual environment that we're currently pointed at. Well, what can you do with that virtual environment? Well, I have this function called check and prompt to install Python packages, which just by the fact that there's an and in this name means the function's doing more than one thing, so maybe I should have split that into two functions. But regardless, this is how it works. So basically, you take the interpreter path, and then you take a list of Python packages to install, and you install them, or you make sure that they're installed. So I thought this was really cool because this is where we start to actually interact with Python itself from the VS Code extension. So here's the top level function. So the first thing we do is we check to see which of those packages are missing. And so here's how we do that. We pass in the interpreter file path and a list of packages. And I have a function called isPythonPackage installed in environment. And you can pass in the interpreter path at a single package to that, and this promise.all statement is actually it's trying to execute all these calls to the function in parallel, which is very cool. So since there's two packages, clearmail and clearmail session, we're hopefully two instances of this function are going to be able to run at the same time. So let's see how that works. So basically, there's a command called pip show, and if you pass in a package name to pip show, it returns a non-zero status code if you don't have a package installed. So that's a perfect way to check if a package is installed. So the rest of this command is the full interpreter path and then -m pip, which like makes sure that we're using the version of pip that corresponds with the virtual environment that we have selected. And so that makes it so that even if we had clearmail and clearmail session installed in some other virtual environment on our machine, this is only going to be successful if they are installed in this one that VS Code is currently pointing at. So that's how that command works. So I made a fancy command called exec. Oh, actually, no, this is part of the Node.js standard library. So in the Node.js standard library, there's this function called exec, and you pass in a string, which is a command, and then it runs that. And when it's done, you get the standard out. Exec will raise an error if it fails, which is perfect. This line here takes the standard out and checks to see if it has this thing that the output would have if it succeeded. So that's cool. I think it also would have been fine I think we actually don't need to do this because the fact that this doesn't raise an error at all means that it returned a non-zero exit code, which does mean that the package exists. But ChatGPT gave me this, so it's good enough for me. So that is how. So check it out. That is how we grabbed. That's how we interacted with Python using VS Code. We basically grab the interpreter path from the Python extension, and then we use that interpreter path to call Python commands from the CLI. So that's how we'll invoke the clearmail session. We'll basically install it, we'll use this interpreter, we'll pass arguments to it, and then we'll try to parse the results. Clearmail session, I believe, also has a file, a JSON file, that it uses to record state. So it's possible that for some use cases, we won't actually have to parse standard output from the ClearML session CLI. It's possible that we can just read it from that file, but I'm not exactly sure. So after that, we prompt the user. After detecting which packages are missing by using pip show, we prompt the user, asking them if they want to install them. And if we were to look at this function, you'd see how I popped the modal. It was pretty easy to do. And then here, there's a function called handle package installation, which is a little long, but the main thing is that at the very end of this, there's a special vscode.window.withProgress function. And this is how I popped a loading bar saying that installation was happening. And one of the things that happens is it calls this installation progress task, which turns around and calls this function called install Python packages in env. And what this does is accepts an interpreter and a list of package names and installs a bunch of packages at once. And you can see here, we have a list of args, and we have -m. So you can imagine we have a path to our interpreter, and then -m, pip install, and then all of our package names. And I did write this function called run shell command, which is quite a complex function. But basically what it does is it lets you run a shell command, and it lets you do that asynchronously, and it lets you process logs as they come into standard out, one log at a time. So a pip install spews many logs out, not all at once, but as sort of a stream. And so one at a time, as those come in, we can print those to the we can print those logs to the trace, to the output channel, which is the dedicated log stream for our VS Code extension. Although ultimately I did make it so that this function could return all the logs as a dump, and I think that I actually did just use that dump to print out the result of the install. Okay, so that is as far as I got. I made a ClearML folder here, and in this ClearML folder we can add calls to the run shell command function, and we can pass in various arguments to the ClearML session CLI. So we can use that for creating and describing the ClearML sessions. I made a folder called UI for UI elements, so presumably this is where we'll define stuff about our menu and how the menu wires up to other functions that actually go and invoke functions here in the ClearML folder to, use ClearML. When we start to actually use ClearML, maybe we can start to make settings in this settings.ts file that are specific to our application. So for example, maybe you want to be able to point to an exact ClearML executable somewhere on your machine and bypass using the Python virtual environment. You could specify that here. Or maybe you have multiple ClearML config files on your machine, and one of them points at a local Docker Compose for development, but another one points at a SaaS-hosted ClearML control plane. We could have a configuration option for different ClearML.conf files. We could also have a configuration option to mute all of the notifications that pop up. Like if a user for some reason doesn't want to have the notifications pop up in the bottom right here, we could have a setting that hides those. If you want to run this yourself, all you got to do is clone this repository, cd in here, and run npm install. And npm install will only work if you have node installed. And that'll install everything you need to run the extension. And then to actually run it, all you do is you go into extension.ts, and you press F5 on your keyboard, just press F5, and doing that will start a debug session, and it's running. And once it's running, VS Code will actually automatically open up a window for you where the extension's activated. And then from there, you can open up the command palette with Command-Shift-P and run the commands like install Python dependencies, and you're working with the extension. Cool, you now know as much as I know about VS Code extensions. So at this point, it would be great if you could look into how to set up a menu and fill it with buttons, or look at the remote SSH plugin and maybe reference the code that's in this project and find out how to invoke commands from the remote SSH plugin, because we're going to need to do that to open up a VS Code window that's connected to the VS Code session. Another one is making a form. When you make a form, you can actually have the form show up as a tab in this tab view, and there could be text boxes and buttons and drop downs and radio buttons in that tab, and maybe a submit button at the bottom. We also need to get an instance of the ClearML server together so that we can start testing against that and have VS Code start issuing real ClearML session commands. We also need to figure out a logo for our extension. We might be able to use the official ClearML logo and convert it white, although I need to check with ClearML and make sure that they're okay with that. Like, there might be copyright issues or something that they're concerned about, and maybe they prefer that we just make some other logo, which is totally fine. There's also CI/CD, like how do we publish this extension to the extension store? There's also tests. How do you write a basic test? for some of these functions that we have here. Maybe pick one or two of those things to think about and browse this code a little bit before meeting up at the hackathon to get a feel for how this extension's working. I hope that this video saved you a lot of time and that you're now much more oriented towards authoring VS Code extensions, because that way you can focus any of your preparation time towards problems that we haven't yet solved. I will see you there.